Imagine you're 12 years old, and before the sun has even risen, your mother gently wakes you and tells you it's time to leave. There isn't time to gather your favorite toys or say goodbye to your friends. Every possession your family owns must fit into a few bags because Japanese forces are advancing across China, and staying behind is no longer an option. Among the frightened families escaping toward Hong Kong is a quiet boy named Li Ka-shing. He isn't thinking about wealth, business, or becoming one of the richest men in history. He's simply hoping his family survives the journey. They arrive in Hong Kong believing the worst is finally behind them, but fate has other plans. Within 3 years, Li's father, a respected school principal, is diagnosed with tuberculosis. As his condition worsens, the family gathers around his bedside, knowing time is running out. Before he dies, he leaves his young son with a simple but life-changing responsibility: work hard, live honestly, and take care of the family. When his father passes away, Li is only 15 years old. His education ends that day. While other boys are still sitting in classrooms dreaming about the future, Li begins working 16-hour days to feed his mother and younger siblings. Every dollar he earns disappears into food, rent, and survival. Most people would have accepted that this was simply the hand life had dealt them. Li Ka-shing refused. Decades later, the world would know him as Superman, the businessman who quietly built one of the greatest empires in history, invested in industries years before everyone else, and accumulated influence so vast that newspapers would eventually describe him as the man who bought half of Britain. But the real story isn't about billions of dollars. It's about a frightened refugee who discovered that survival was the greatest education he would ever receive. Because before Li Ka-shing learned how to build an empire, he first had to learn how to carry the weight of an entire family on the shoulders of a 15-year-old boy. Opening a business is difficult. Opening one with almost no money is even harder. But Li Ka-shing had one advantage that many entrepreneurs lacked: he had already spent years learning from other people's mistakes without risking his own money. In 1950, he founded Chung Kong Industries inside a modest factory that was far from impressive. There were no glamorous offices, no large workforce, and no wealthy investors waiting to write checks. Every order mattered because one mistake could end the company before it truly began. At first, Li manufactured ordinary plastic products, just like many of his competitors. But he quickly realized something that would define the rest of his career: if you sell the same product as everyone else, the only thing left to compete on is price. He refused to build a business that survived by being the cheapest. Instead, he became obsessed with making his products better than anyone else's. One day, he came across a magazine showcasing beautiful plastic flowers being produced in Europe. Most manufacturers would have copied what they saw and moved on. Li did something different. He spent months studying the colors, textures, and shapes of real flowers, determined to understand why artificial flowers always looked fake. Employees later remembered how demanding he became during this period. If a petal didn't curve naturally, production stopped. If the colors looked dull, he ordered new mixtures. If a flower failed to resemble the real thing, it went back to the drawing board. To many workers, it seemed excessive. To Li, perfection wasn't an expense, it was an investment. Then came the breakthrough. After countless experiments, his team discovered a new way of blending pigments into plastic, creating flowers so lifelike that customers often had to touch them to tell the difference. That small improvement changed everything. One afternoon, an international buyer walked through the factory looking for suppliers. He wasn't expecting to discover anything extraordinary. But as he examined Li's flowers, he stopped, picked one up, and looked at it more closely. According to those who later told the story, he couldn't believe they were made of plastic. Before leaving the factory, he placed an order so large it transformed the future of Chung Kong overnight. Suddenly, Li's flowers weren't just being sold in Hong Kong. They were crossing the Pacific and arriving in homes across the United States. Orders multiplied. Profits grew. The frightened refugee who had once struggled to feed his family had finally built a successful company. Most entrepreneurs would have celebrated. Many would have bought a larger house or rewarded themselves for years of sacrifice. Li Ka-shing did neither. Instead, he quietly began looking for his next opportunity. He believed the fortune he had just earned wasn't the destination. It was merely the ticket to enter a much bigger game. And that game would begin with a crisis that had nearly everyone else running for safety. Most fortunes are built during times of prosperity. Li Ka-shing built his during fear. In 1967, Hong Kong erupted into chaos as riots swept through the city, fueled by the Cultural Revolution taking place across the border in mainland China. Streets that once buzzed with business were suddenly filled with smoke, protests, and homemade bombs. Shops closed their doors. Wealthy families packed their belongings. Investors who had spent decades building fortunes couldn't sell their properties fast enough. Every newspaper carried the same message: get out while you still can. To almost everyone, Hong Kong looked like a city with no future. But Li Ka-shing had spent his entire life surviving situations that other people believed were hopeless. While investors saw panic, he saw emotion. And emotion, he believed, often made people do irrational things. He asked himself a simple question: has Hong Kong truly lost its value? Or have people simply lost their courage? The answer changed his life. Quietly, while fear was driving prices lower every week, Li began buying land. Friends thought he was making the biggest mistake of his career. Advisors warned him he was risking everything he had worked so hard to build. Some couldn't understand why a man who had finally escaped poverty would gamble his entire fortune on a city that seemed to be collapsing. Li listened to every warning. And bought another property anyway. He wasn't betting on the next 6 months. He was betting on the next 30 years. He believed that governments would change, headlines would disappear, and riots would eventually end. But one thing would remain exactly where it had always been: Hong Kong's extraordinary position as the gateway between China and the rest of the world. If he was right, the land everyone was abandoning would one day become some of the most valuable real estate on earth. He was right. As order slowly returned, property prices began climbing, then soaring. The buildings and land that others had practically given away became the foundation of an empire. Almost overnight, Hong Kong was no longer just a plastics company. It had become one of Hong Kong's fastest-growing property developers, and Li Ka-shing had quietly joined the ranks of the city's wealthiest businessmen. But becoming rich was never his real ambition. During those years, he noticed something few people talked about. No matter how successful Chinese entrepreneurs became, the biggest companies in Hong Kong were still controlled by powerful British trading houses that had dominated the colony for generations. They owned the ports. They owned the utilities. They owned the shipping companies. They owned the very arteries that kept Hong Kong alive. Most businessmen accepted that reality. Li Ka-shing didn't. Sitting in his office one evening, he began asking himself a question that sounded almost impossible: if the British built these companies, why couldn't a refugee from China own them? It was a dangerous thought. It was also the beginning of the boldest move of his entire career. Imagine walking into a room where everyone has already decided you don't belong. That was the world Li Ka-shing was about to enter. For more than 100 years, Hong Kong's economy had been ruled by powerful British trading houses. They weren't simply companies. They were institutions. Their names were printed on the city's tallest buildings, their executives advised governors, and their influence reached into nearly every corner of business. To most people, these companies looked permanent, almost untouchable. Chinese entrepreneurs could become successful, but the commanding heights of Hong Kong's economy still belonged to the British establishment. Then something happened that almost nobody expected. In 1979, one of those giants stumbled. Hutchison Whampoa, one of the oldest and most prestigious British companies in Hong Kong, had fallen into financial difficulty after years of aggressive expansion. The Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, today known simply as HSBC, suddenly found itself controlling a company it never intended to own. The bank faced a difficult decision. Who could they trust to take it over? Wealthy British families were interested. Powerful corporations were watching closely. Behind closed doors, the future of one of Hong Kong's most important companies was quietly being negotiated. Then an unexpected name entered the conversation. Li Ka-shing. Think about what that meant. Just a few decades earlier, he had been a teenage refugee working 16-hour days to keep his family alive. Now Britain's most influential bank was considering handing one of its crown jewels to the very person the old business establishment had once overlooked. Why? Because Li had built something far more valuable than wealth. He had built trust. Bankers who had negotiated with him over the years noticed something unusual. He rarely chased headlines. He almost never overpaid. He honored his commitments. When he gave his word, people believed him. In business, that reputation became more valuable than any balance sheet. After months of negotiations, HSBC made a decision that sent shockwaves through Hong Kong. It sold Li Ka-shing a controlling stake in Hutchison Whampoa. For the first time in modern history, a Chinese businessman had taken control of one of the great British companies that had helped shape colonial Hong Kong. Newspapers covered the deal as a financial triumph. But beneath the headlines, something much larger had just happened. A door that had been closed for generations had quietly opened. Yet Li Ka-shing wasn't celebrating because he knew something almost everyone else missed. Buying Hutchison wasn't the victory. It was the key that unlocked a much bigger empire. And what he would do with that key would eventually reach far beyond Hong Kong. All the way to Britain itself. At 15, Li Ka-shing stopped asking himself what he wanted to become and started asking a far more difficult question: how do I keep my family alive? Every morning before most of Hong Kong had opened its doors, he was already on his way to work. He found a job in a plastics trading company where 16-hour days became his normal routine. There were no weekends to look forward to and no promise that tomorrow would be easier than today. The young refugee watched experienced businessmen negotiate with customers, listened carefully to factory owners discuss costs, and paid attention to every mistake they made. Unlike many employees who simply wanted to finish their shift and go home, Li treated every hour as another lesson that school could never have taught him. His supervisors quickly noticed something different about the quiet teenager. He wasn't just hardworking, he was endlessly curious. If a customer rejected a product, Li wanted to know why. If a shipment arrived late, he wanted to understand what had gone wrong. If another company made a better product, he studied it instead of complaining about it. Years later, he would say that knowledge was the only asset nobody could take away from you. While other young men spent their wages as quickly as they earned them, Li saved every dollar he could. Poverty had taught him something most successful people never learn until much later in life: every dollar had a job before it ever reached his pocket. But then, during countless hours surrounded by sheets of plastic and manufacturing equipment, he noticed something that everyone else seemed to ignore. Across Europe and America, plastic was no longer being used only for practical goods. Manufacturers had started experimenting with decorative products, especially artificial flowers. Most factory owners dismissed them as cheap imitations that would never replace real flowers. Li saw something completely different. Real flowers wilted. Plastic flowers didn't. Real flowers had to be grown, transported, and replaced. Plastic flowers could be shipped anywhere in the world and last for years. It wasn't simply a product. It was an opportunity hiding inside something almost everyone else considered ordinary. At just 22 years old, with little money, no wealthy investors, and no famous family name to open doors, Li Ka-shing made the decision that would change his life forever. He walked away from the security of his job to build a company of his own. To almost everyone around him, it looked reckless. To Li, it was the first time he truly believed his future could be different. What happened next would transform a tiny factory making plastic flowers into the foundation of one of the greatest business empires the world has ever seen. If Hutchison Whampoa was the key, Li Ka-shing wasted no time discovering which doors it could unlock. Most businessmen would have spent years celebrating an acquisition of that size. Li did the opposite. He immediately began walking through every division of the company, asking questions that many executives had stopped asking years before. What business are we really in? What should we keep? What should we sell? What will the world need 20 years from now? Those who worked with him often described a leader who wasn't emotionally attached to any company, building, or investment. That confused people. Most entrepreneurs fall in love with what they build. Li fell in love with what something could become. If a business had reached its peak, he wasn't afraid to sell it. If another industry held greater promise, He quietly redirected his capital there. It was a habit that would make him billions of dollars over the next 4 decades. He wasn't collecting trophies. He was constantly repositioning himself for the future. Imagine playing a game of chess where everyone else is focused on the move in front of them, while you're already thinking 10 moves ahead. That was Li Ka-shing. Every acquisition wasn't the end of a journey, it was preparation for the next opportunity. Through Hutchison, he expanded into ports, shipping, retail, infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy. Slowly, almost invisibly, his companies began touching the lives of hundreds of millions of people who had never heard his name. A family shopping at a pharmacy in London. A cargo ship unloading thousands of containers in Rotterdam. A commuter making a phone call in Britain. A supermarket customer buying groceries in Hong Kong. None of them realized they were helping build the fortune of a man who had once struggled to buy dinner. Yet what made Li extraordinary wasn't simply the size of his empire. It was his ability to recognize when the world was changing before everyone else did. While many business leaders were still arguing about whether mobile phones would ever replace landlines, Li was investing in telecommunications. While others saw ports as old-fashioned infrastructure, he saw them as the arteries of global trade. He understood a simple truth that many investors ignored: the world will always change, but people will always need to move, communicate, eat, drink, and consume energy. If you owned the systems that made those things possible, you weren't just buying companies, you were buying pieces of everyday life. Then, as the 1990s approached, Li began watching something else unfold. Hong Kong's future was becoming increasingly uncertain. The date that had been discussed for years was finally approaching. In 1997, Britain would hand Hong Kong back to China. Politicians debated it. Investors worried about it. International businesses quietly prepared for it. Most people were asking what would happen to Hong Kong. Li Ka-shing was asking a very different question. If the center of gravity is about to shift, where should I place my empire next? The answer would lead him to make one of the boldest investment decisions of his life, one so ambitious that newspapers would eventually claim a single businessman had quietly bought half of Britain. By the late 1980s, Li Ka-shing had already achieved something that few people thought possible. He had gone from refugee to one of Asia's most respected businessmen. Most entrepreneurs would have spent the rest of their lives protecting what they had built. Li was preparing to leave his comfort zone again. While the world's attention remained fixed on Hong Kong and the approaching 1997 handover, Li's eyes were looking somewhere else entirely: Britain. To many investors, Britain looked mature, expensive, and slow. The greatest opportunities, they believed, were in fast-growing economies. Li disagreed. He wasn't searching for the fastest-growing businesses. He was searching for the businesses people could never live without. That difference changed everything. Instead of chasing fashionable companies, Li began quietly acquiring infrastructure. It wasn't glamorous enough to dominate newspaper headlines, but it was the invisible machinery that kept an entire country alive. Through Hutchison, he expanded into ports that handled millions of shipping containers every year. Then came telecommunications. His company launched what would eventually become one of Britain's largest mobile phone networks, connecting millions of customers across the country. He invested in electricity distribution, acquiring companies that supplied power to homes and businesses. He expanded into natural gas, helping provide energy to millions of families. Then came retail. Pharmacies. Health and beauty stores. Supermarkets. Water infrastructure. Logistics. One acquisition became another, and another after that. None of them looked spectacular by themselves. But Li wasn't building headlines. He was building an ecosystem. Imagine waking up in London. You charge your phone using electricity supplied by one of Li's companies. On your way to work, you make a call over his mobile network. At lunch, you stop at a pharmacy owned by his retail group. That evening, groceries arrive through ports controlled by his business empire before being transported through distribution networks connected to companies he owned. You might go through your entire day without ever hearing his name, yet his businesses quietly touched your life from morning until night. That was the brilliance of Li Ka-shing. He didn't buy symbols of wealth. He bought the systems that made modern life possible. It wasn't long before journalists began noticing something extraordinary. They added up his holdings and reached a conclusion that sounded almost unbelievable. One businessman controlled significant parts of Britain's ports, telecommunications, electricity, natural gas, retail, and infrastructure. Headlines started calling him the man who bought half of Britain. Of course, he didn't literally own half the country. What he owned was something many believed was even more valuable: the arteries through which the country's economy flowed. It was one of the boldest investment strategies of the modern era, and almost nobody had seen it happening because Li had never announced a grand plan. He simply kept buying essential businesses while everyone else was chasing exciting ones. But just when the world thought it had finally understood Li Ka-shing's strategy, he made another move that stunned investors around the globe. He began selling some of the very assets that had made him legendary. The world thought it had finally figured Li Ka-shing out. Every business magazine described him as the billionaire quietly buying Britain, and every new acquisition seemed to reinforce that reputation. Then, almost without warning, he did something that confused investors across the globe. He started selling. At first, almost nobody paid attention. Billionaires buy and sell companies all the time. But as the transactions continued, people began asking an uncomfortable question: what does Li Ka-shing know that the rest of us don't? One of the biggest surprises came when he sold the Center, one of Hong Kong's most recognizable skyscrapers, in what became one of the largest office building transactions in Asia's history. It wasn't a distressed sale. He wasn't desperate for cash. Quite the opposite. He sold at a time when values were exceptionally high, locking in enormous profits while others were still convinced prices would continue rising. To many observers, it looked like he was walking away from some of the finest assets he had spent decades building. Newspapers speculated endlessly. Some claimed he had lost confidence in Hong Kong. Others believed he was abandoning China altogether. Critics even accused him of taking his money overseas after making his fortune at home. Li rarely responded to the headlines. He almost never explained his strategy in public because he believed something simple: the market doesn't reward explanations, it rewards decisions. But those who had followed his career closely recognized a familiar pattern. This wasn't new. It was exactly what he had done his entire life. He bought when fear was highest, held patiently while value grew, and sold when everyone else finally believed the opportunity was obvious. Then he quietly moved on to the next idea long before the crowd arrived. It was the same strategy he had used with plastic flowers. The same strategy he had used during the Hong Kong property crisis. The same strategy that had led him to Britain's infrastructure. Li Ka-shing wasn't emotionally attached to buildings, companies, or even countries. He was attached to opportunity. That mindset separated him from almost every investor of his generation. While others asked, "How much is this worth today?" Li kept asking a different question: where will the world be 10 years from now? It was a question that led him somewhere almost nobody expected. While much of the business world was still debating the future of the internet, a man in his 80s quietly began writing checks to tiny technology companies that many people dismissed as risky experiments. Once again, Li Ka-shing wasn't looking at the world as it was. He was investing in the world as it was about to become. By the mid-1990s, Li Ka-shing seemed untouchable. His companies stretched across continents. Governments respected him. Bankers trusted him. Investors followed his every move. From the outside, it looked as though he had mastered every challenge life could throw at him. But then, on an ordinary day in 1996, everything changed with a single phone call. His eldest son, Victor Li, had disappeared. He hadn't been delayed in traffic. He hadn't missed a meeting. He had been kidnapped by one of China's most feared criminals, Chung Se-kung, a man the newspapers would later nickname Big Spender. Unlike ordinary kidnappers who hid in the shadows, Chung had built a terrifying reputation by targeting some of the wealthiest families in Hong Kong, believing that if you kidnapped a billionaire's child, the family would always choose life over money. This time, he had chosen the richest family in Asia. Imagine being Li Ka-shing that evening. You have spent your entire life solving problems that nobody else could solve. You have negotiated billion-dollar deals across continents. You have outsmarted competitors, predicted markets, and built one of the greatest fortunes in modern history. Yet now you are sitting in your own home, staring at a telephone, knowing that every decision you make could determine whether your son lives or dies. Suddenly, none of the skyscrapers matter. None of the ports matter. None of the billions matter. According to accounts that later emerged, Chung himself came to Li's residence to negotiate face-to-face. There were no teams of lawyers. No board of directors. No security experts making the decision. It was simply a father sitting across from the man who held his son's life in his hands. Chung demanded an astonishing 1 billion Hong Kong dollars, one of the largest ransom payments the world had ever heard of. Many expected Li to negotiate. Others expected him to involve the police. Instead, he did something that surprised almost everyone. He agreed to pay. To some people, paying the ransom looked like surrender. Li saw it differently. He understood something every parent understands instinctively. Money can be earned again. A son's life cannot. Victor was released alive. The world praised Li's calmness under unimaginable pressure, but few people stopped to consider what that experience must have done to him. Imagine realizing that despite all your wealth, all your influence, and all your success, you were still powerless to guarantee the safety of the people you loved most. It was a painful reminder of a lesson life had already taught him decades earlier when he lost his father. Wealth can solve many problems. It cannot eliminate uncertainty. It cannot eliminate grief. It cannot eliminate fear. Years later, mainland authorities captured Chung Se-kung, and he was executed after a trial in China, bringing one chapter to an end. But for Li Ka-shing, the experience reinforced something he had believed his entire life: money is a tool, never the destination. And perhaps that explains why, despite becoming one of the richest men on earth, he would soon make a decision that even his own sons never saw coming. A few years after Victor's kidnapping, the people closest to Li Ka-shing began noticing something different about him. He still studied markets with the same discipline. He still read reports late into the night. He still searched for tomorrow's opportunities before anyone else could see them. But the conversations were changing. They became less about how much more he could build and more about what would remain after he was gone. For a man who had spent his life thinking decades ahead, this wasn't an unusual question. It was simply the next investment. One evening, as he later recalled, he lay awake thinking about his fortune. He had worked for every dollar. He had survived war, poverty, heartbreak, and unimaginable pressure to build it. Then a thought entered his mind that he couldn't shake. If I had another son, I would gladly give him 1/3 of everything I own. The next afternoon, he invited Victor and Richard to lunch. It wasn't a board meeting. It wasn't a discussion about business. It was a conversation between a father and his two sons. As they sat down, Li smiled and said something that left both of them stunned. "You have another brother." The room fell silent. His sons looked at one another in complete confusion. Another brother? They had never heard of one. Had their father been hiding a secret from them all these years? Li let the silence linger for a moment before explaining what he meant. He wasn't talking about another child. He was talking about a responsibility. He told them that 1/3 of his fortune would not belong to the family. It would belong to a foundation dedicated to education, medical research, disaster relief, and improving lives around the world. Then he said something his sons would never forget. Treat the foundation as you would your younger brother. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was an instruction. Just as family members protect one another, he expected them to protect that mission long after he was gone. For many billionaires, philanthropy comes after success. For Li Ka-shing, it became part of the purpose of success. Through the Li Ka-shing Foundation, billions of dollars flowed into universities, hospitals, scientific research, scholarships, and humanitarian projects across Asia and beyond. Students who had never heard his story received an education because of a decision he made in the middle of the night. Patients met doctors trained in facilities his foundation helped build. Researchers searching for cures found support when few others believed in them. Looking back, It's hard not to see the influence of the 15-year-old boy who once had to abandon school because his family could no longer afford it. Perhaps every scholarship he funded was, in some small way, a gift to the child he never had the chance to become. And maybe that is the greatest irony of Li Ka-shing's life. The world remembers the billionaire who quietly bought pieces of Britain, built ports across continents, and made fortunes by seeing tomorrow before everyone else. But the legacy he seemed most proud of wasn't measured in skyscrapers or stock prices. It was measured in the lives he hoped strangers would never have to struggle through the way he once did. That may be the greatest investment he ever made. Because unlike a company, a building, or even an empire, its value could continue growing long after his own story came to an end. In 2018, at the age of 89, Li Ka-shing stood before the world and quietly announced that he was stepping down. There was no dramatic farewell, no emotional speech celebrating his achievements, and no attempt to remind people of everything he had accomplished. That wasn't his style. He simply handed the leadership of the empire to his eldest son, Victor, the same son whose life had once hung in the balance during one of Hong Kong's most terrifying kidnappings. For many people, it marked the end of one of the greatest business careers in modern history. But if you think Li Ka-shing's story is about becoming rich, you've missed the real lesson. His greatest achievement wasn't building an empire worth hundreds of billions of dollars. It was never allowing success to erase the lessons that poverty had taught him. Even after becoming one of Asia's wealthiest men, visitors were often surprised by how simply he lived. He wore an inexpensive citizen watch instead of one of the luxury timepieces billionaires often collect. He preferred straightforward meals, avoided unnecessary extravagance, and believed that money should be respected rather than displayed. To some, it looked like humility. To Li, it was simply common sense. He knew how quickly life could change because he had already lived through war, the loss of his father, crushing poverty, the death of his wife, the kidnapping of his son, and decades of uncertainty in business. Those experiences taught him something no university could ever teach. Wealth is temporary. Character is permanent. Perhaps that is why Li Ka-shing spent so much of his life looking toward tomorrow instead of celebrating yesterday. While others chased recognition, he chased preparation. While others argued about politics, he studied technology. While others saw buildings, he saw the cities that would one day surround them. While others saw today's profits, he saw the next generation. Looking back, it becomes clear that the greatest investment Li Ka-shing ever made wasn't in ports, electricity, mobile networks, or real estate. It was in the discipline to think differently when everyone else was thinking the same. Time and again, he refused to follow the crowd. He bought when fear dominated the headlines. He sold when greed convinced everyone prices would rise forever. He invested in ideas long before they became obvious. That wasn't luck. It was a lifetime of training his mind to remain calm while the rest of the world reacted emotionally. So perhaps the most remarkable part of Li Ka-shing's story isn't that a refugee from wartime China quietly built one of the greatest business empires the world has ever known. It's that he never stopped being the 15-year-old boy who stood beside his father's bed and accepted a responsibility far greater than himself. Every decision he made afterward, from the plastic flowers that launched his first company, to the properties he bought during Hong Kong's darkest days, to the British infrastructure that earned him the nickname the man who bought half of Britain, to the foundation he called his third son, can be traced back to one simple promise: protect the future. That's the legacy he leaves behind. Not a fortune. Not a skyscraper. Not even an empire. But a way of thinking that reminds us all that extraordinary lives are rarely built by chasing today's success. They are built by preparing for tomorrow long before anyone else believes tomorrow is coming.